Welcome to Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno.
If you suddenly walk through your front door and find yourself in ancient Egypt, are you having a multiverse experience, or are you just plain nuts? Is it possible to live in multiverse awareness without finding yourself in the psych ward? What's real and what isn't?
Hey, and welcome to the 186th edition of Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno. On our Monday drive time show on WOON 1240 AM and www.oneworldwide.com. I'm Ben, and asking those really weird questions was my co-host and partner in the paranormal, my dad.
My really weird dad. We have no guest this evening. It's an open line show, and we'll be answering some of the hundreds of emails we received after our October 13th appearance on Coast to Coast AM with George Nuri.
There's a giant stack of them here, but before we do that, our weekly paranormal contest is at hand. So last week's question, in what U.S. state will you incur a $10,000 fine and 5 years in prison if you kill a Bigfoot? And the answer is the state of Washington.
Yes, in 1969, Washington's Skamania County, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, Board of Commissioners passed an ordinance setting out a $10,000 fine, 5 years in prison for anyone who killed a Bigfoot in that county. So it's not a state law, but nevertheless. The winner was Kelly Redmond of Tacoma, Washington.
No, irony. I guess she knows the law very well.
Skamania County, right?
Or she's a lawyer. Who knows?
Maybe.
So let's try something else. This week, the question is, what is considered the most haunted house in Australia? Well, that's really out there.
Well, we got a lot out back. You mean we got a lot of listeners in Australia? So some.
That's funny. Anyway, so if you can handle that, call us locally at 401-766-1240 or from anywhere in the U.S. at 800-449-1240. If I don't announce a winner during the show and you still think you have a shot, drop a line to me at banditbehindtheparanormal.com.
The winner will receive a copy of my last book, Turning Home, God, Ghosts, and Human Destiny.
All right, so this is a great time to call in. So our numbers today, nationally at 800-449-1240 or locally at 401-766-1240.
Okay, so before we go to our emails, I feel I have to make a comment that there are a number of people who wrote either on the question form that is on the BehindTheParanormal.com website or who wrote just to Paul at BehindTheParanormal.com, and they have issues that they feel need to be answered, possible paranormal problems, and are frightened and everything else. I just ask you to understand that we're only two of us here, and I do a lot of the answering myself, and it's just there are. Well, for example, one lady has been writing to us from Florida, a bit irate that I haven't answered her yet. There are 172 people in front of her who wrote after this coast-to-coast appearance who are all asking for answers. Just please be patient. We are only two people, and we don't have any money, and we don't have a lot of resources, and we just try to advise people as best we can according to my experience and our knowledge on these paranormal issues. I know people are afraid. I know that they're worried, but please try and be patient. I do encourage you not to call just anybody, however. All that being said, you don't know who certain groups may be. A lot of them are just sort of out there curiosity seekers or are not competent to deal with people.
But we do have people on a good list that we approve of.
We do. We have reporters. We call the show reporters in different parts of the country whom I would feel confident assigning to help you if you're in that area. And there is someone in Florida. Matter of fact, we have someone in the Midwest, the Southwest, the Upper Midwest, and even in England right now. So if you are one of the people who's been asking for help, drop us a line again if you would be willing to talk to someone else. But we do encourage you to ask us the advice about that, and there are one or two people who can help you with that, so you wouldn't have to just wait for us. So all that being said, let's go to our first email here, and this is one well, go ahead and read it. But anyway, it's from Barbara in Pittsfield, Illinois.
All right, and she writes, I have searched for someone who understands what I feel. The Bible says not to talk to the dead, but I know my husband is with me. I feel him, he lets me know in numerous ways. Reading what you say on your site is exactly how I feel. I don't want to talk to mediums. I have and was never completely sure with them. Yeah, that's a good point.
That's why we're reading this.
Yes.
That's a good point.
But I do know he is with me, and he does communicate through dreams and with everyday things. Thank you for saying what you did on your site. It helps me. I had been worried I was wrong to talk to him from what the Bible says, but the way I look at it, we are not talking to the dead, but they are not dead. They are changed in form to spirit or energy or whatever you call it, but not dead. Thank you for your thoughts on the subject.
Okay, now the reason we read that, it's not a question, it's more in the nature of an observation, and it's kind of self-serving. I mean, a lot of these emails, people just kind of go, aha. Never really understood this until you explained it that way. And it's not Ben and me explaining it. We just give out information. We tell you what we think and what we believe, and it's up to you to take it and decide if it's any good or not. But this lady, Barbara here, gets it. And there are so many people who don't. People write in asking, can you recommend a good medium? Can you recommend a good psychic? And the answer is no. It's not that there aren't good mediums or good psychics, but a lot of them may have legitimate gifts, but they don't get it. They don't interpret it properly, in our opinion, and this sort of thing. So there are a few who do, but we think that, well, as I say, I tend to be kind of a paranormal socialist at times. I think all of us should be able to do our own work in the paranormal, because the paranormal is the background to our lives. And here's an example. This lady obviously lost her husband, although that's not a good way to put it. The nature of her husband's life has changed. He's no longer physically present with her, but then again he is. In our multiverse idea, parallel worlds in which people never died. Examples of that we've cited many times on this show. So this woman gets it. She understands that you don't need mediums and psychics. You don't need to do all kinds of special things to do something as simple as remain in contact and in love with your loved ones. One of the problems, Ben and I were talking about the problems of society, and one of them is that people think, things are so complicated that they can't understand them. They need machines, they need medicines, they need some kind of artificial things to help them get things done.
That's why holistic medicine is coming back.
Yeah, that's true. You can help yourself. This woman has it exactly right. And, I mean, the Bible, first of all, don't be too sure you know what the Bible says, if you're a Christian who believes in the Bible or even Jewish, because the original translation, we don't know what they said. Half of the ones in English are wrong. But in your heart, if you are in touch with someone who has passed, quote-unquote, in this simple, quiet way, then you probably are. Love cuts through all kinds of things, including the boundaries of these parallel worlds, as we say in the paranormal. So I think that Barbara really has it nailed here, and it's simple love. That's all there is to it, and I think that she's got it very, very well said and understood here. Okay, here's an interesting one. This is from Tom in Barrington, New Hampshire. Okay. And Tom has a question about something that a lot of people have been asking about.
Okay, so Tom writes to us. What are your thoughts on the 1928 Charlie Chaplin movie The Circus, containing a time traveler, hoax or possible?
Okay, that's a good question. Now, that doesn't seem to be a really relevant question as far as a lot of the paranormal issues are concerned, but a lot of people have been asking about this film. If you have access to YouTube on the internet, you can see this film. Just put in Chaplin, Chaplin, as in Charlie Chaplin, and 1928, or Circus. The name of the film was The Circus. And what this footage is of, as I understand it, and I have seen it several times, I've looked at it very closely, is a sort of a documentary about the premiere of this film, and it's outside, the Chinese theater, as it's called, in Hollywood, where a lot of premieres have occurred and still do.
Yeah.
And there were a lot of people there, and in one of the scenes, there's a fake zebra standing out in front of the theater, and two people walk by. One is an ordinary-looking fellow, and the other is a woman, again, clearly dressed in early 20th century clothing, with something held up to her mouth that looks just like a cell phone. And you can see something black in her hand, and she's got, her hands just as if we would hold it. And she's talking. And everybody says, aha, a cell phone from 1928. This must be a time traveler. Well, so a number of questions arise here. And it does very much look like she's talking on a cell phone. But the questions that arise, for example, are, all right, who's she talking to? To use a cell phone, if that's what it was, you need some sort of major infrastructure, such as cell towers or satellites or something like this. Now, there is some information on this that may or may not be the case, but it makes the most sense to me. Someone has come forward and said this is their I think not grandparents, but grand aunt and grand uncle. Because the thing that struck me was that the man is walking not very far in front of her. And to me, I don't know about you, Ben, but I'm creeped out today when I'm walking down the street and somebody's talking on a cell phone. There's nobody there, Yeah, I get creeped out when I go into the living room and you're talking with your girlfriend on the computer and I hear this disembodied voice.
No, you don't. Well, you do, but usually I have headphones on and it looks like I'm just talking to my computer like, hi.
Well, I still think it's creepy because in 1928...
Well, it is creepy.
This man certainly would have heard her. Probably would have turned around and looked and all this sort of thing. So what this fellow who came forward claims is that this is his grand aunt and grand uncle, and that he was walking a little bit in front of her. They were going to the premiere of the film, and that the woman had recently become the victim of dementia, and that what she was really doing was holding her hand up to fix a comb and to scratch her head, sort of a hair comb, and to scratch her head, which was a nervous habit she had developed, and talking to herself all the way. So that certainly would explain it. I think so. Again, check it out on YouTube, circus film by Charlie Chaplin, and see what you think yourself. But firstly, I think that's a very good explanation. Now here's a longer one. This is from Jay in Detroit, and we'll just Ben, if you could just
read the entire thing.
It's very long. Well, a lot of these are very long, so just bear with it, and sort of we'll take it in sections.
Oh, okay. So I listened to you last evening on Coast to Coast, and I am hoping that you are able to share some information. I reside in an old family home, which I am certain is located on a spiritual vortex. Many of my ancestors and family members have experienced unusual phenomenon here over the past 125 years.
Let's hold it down and explain what a so-called spiritual vortex is.
Okay.
We do find that there are places that have a lot of concentrated energy coming up out of the ground. Now, these are more geotechnical than they are spiritual, in my opinion. Spiritual is a slippery term. And these can be created by seismic forces or other things we don't really understand. But there are a lot of electromagnetic fields that are generated by the Earth, because the Earth is really a giant electrical generator, because it turns around its core and all this business, and then it creates electricity, which in turn, electrical currents have electromagnetic fields around them. So there are places that we find that one of the necessary ducts that has to be lined up for paranormal events to occur is that you have these vortices, for lack of a better term, coming up out of the ground. And they can be measured, and they can have an effect. They are exacerbated or made more powerful by things like sandy or clay soils or high water tables. We find that. So this guy may be onto something if this force actually exists. So go ahead.
All right, so during the past 30 years, since I have lived here, I have had ancestral visitations and seen extraordinary visions. The most unusual was two beings, one bearded red-haired man who lived on a plane in the sky.
P-L-A-I-N.
Yeah, not like a flying plane.
Yeah.
He was a very powerful, very angry, and paced back and forth while cursing and making thunder and lightning. Sounds like Thor.
Yeah, kind of.
At the time, I observed a beautiful lady of a pale complexion who was dressed in blue. Her head was bowed, and she had very kind eyes, but seemed to be embarrassed by my making eye contact with her. She lifted her head, and smiled at me, but was pained and shed tears because of something awful that she caused here on earth. She was kneeling and seemed to be part of a mountain. Just before I saw these beings, I experienced a drain of ordinary life force and an infusion of heightened energy and awareness which lasted for about 3 weeks, a period of time which I lived between two worlds. I could hear the thoughts and intentions of individuals and saw light around people and objects, and was aware of the underlying meaning of coincidences, and was able to see into the future.
Okay, let's hold it there. A little explanation is needed. Now, as you listen to this in your car or wherever you may be, this guy might come across like a blithering lunatic. All right, you're seeing angry red-haired men and all these, strange female humanoid here or whatever and all this stuff. But, coming out of the academic background that I come out of and all this sort of thing, I like to think that our feet are on the ground. Ben and I approach the paranormal from we have different talents in that direction. But one thing we find that is undeniable is that in these situations where, as we would put it, worlds intersect and blend and cross and otherwise are active and accessible by us by means of these very energies we talked about before, which seem to play havoc with space-time at times. These things happen. They can be real. We've seen it ourselves. The big case I'm always citing that we've been working on for several years in Connecticut, this is a normal day for these people. Strange people, creatures that essentially would be undefinable and unable to be categorized in our own lexicon of life, seem to go trotting through the living room on every possible case. Everybody witnesses this, and this is the sort of thing that we need to take more seriously, not just say, well, the person's a nut. You have to broaden your mind here. In quantum physics, in the interpretation of the multiverse, if the particular physicist believes it, you will be told that anything that is possible, anything that is conceivable, including weird creatures and strange guys with red hair running around or whatever, is possible somewhere or somewhen in these parallel worlds. And it is possible they can cross into ours when the energies are right, and you can have legitimate experiences such as this. The problem is that we are so narrow-minded about these sorts of things that we consider these people crazy. We used to lock them up. Now we fill their pockets full of pills, and we just say, well, they're schizos. Well, they're not necessarily true. And as I've often, those of you who know me know that I worked in psychiatric hospitals as a grad student and as a student for the priesthood many years ago. And a lot of these people were the sanest people I had ever met in my life, and among the most intelligent. So don't be so quick to write off things like this. Okay, Ben.
Right. So the conclusion of this state embedded, but never left completely, and I am forever changed. Since this experience about 20 years ago, I have had a hard time functioning normally. I am jobless and I'm almost comfortable alone. The house is in shambles, and I have a difficult time in normal relationships. I have tried, but just can't seem to pull myself out of this state. Do you have any suggestions as to what I can do to regain my footing and learn to function in ways that brings me peace and allows me to live a happier life? What can I do to protect myself from going too far into the other side again?
Okay, very, very good point. Very, very good letter. Now, I would only say to Jay that there are 2 points that he makes here at the end, or brings up at the end of his note. One, that when you are aware of these other worlds, and the thing is, they are not; these worlds are not separate from each other. In our experience, they're real. They are around us all the time, next to us all the time, and our life is shared with the life in those other worlds. It's not a closed system. It's an open system, as it's said in physics. And these things are real. The problem is, as I just suggested, that when we are aware of these other worlds, when we're aware of our other lives, that we're living in what here is our subconscious mind, when we're living these other lives in these parallel worlds, we very often will maybe lose our footing in this one. And that is when you tend to be judged by our society as being crazy. Now, interestingly, as I often say, in primitive societies, so-called, these people were considered holy. They were considered in touch with the big picture. They were considered in touch with greater realities, and they were almost super people because they were in touch with their lives in other worlds and their experiences, their knowledge, their wisdom, or their mistakes or whatever in these parallel lives. Okay, this is something that regression therapists are becoming aware of. If you believe in reincarnation and all this sort of thing, this explains all of that. But how to remain with feet on the ground. Okay, first of all, we do have to live in our conscious world, which is at the moment is this one. We have to make the best of it. As far as how to keep one's feet on the ground, how to fit in, it's a matter of tying into the worlds where you have the most knowledge, wisdom, and experience, if you can do that. I suggest meditation as a way to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Ben, you have some experience with this. What would you suggest to Jay?
Well, I don't know why you'd want to be a part of this world, but...
well, you have to keep, I know what you mean.
Well, you have to be able to function in normal life.
You can always be a rebel. But.
Yes, but if you can't function and you can't pay attention because you're just, like, I don't know, you're just all over the place, and like me in class today, for example, because I was like, I don't know, I think I was like falling asleep or something, I don't know. But the point being is that meditation is what keeps you grounded, and if you do that, it'll bring everything together, and then it'll bring your mind, body, and soul together and not separated like everything else wants you to think. Oh, your brain is separate from everything else, or your soul is separate from everything else. It's all in one package.
Yeah.
It's a package deal.
Put it together rather than take it apart.
Yeah.
Well, it's funny, you and I were talking yesterday about the importance of sleep.
Oh, yeah.
And again, talking about simple answers to complicated questions. They're not really complicated questions. Get enough sleep. As Ben yawns here, it's important to simply balance your life.
Have a nice diet. Exercise once a day.
Yeah, I mean, these are all simple and common pieces of advice here, but this can help you balance your larger super life, if you want to call it that. You are blessed that you can be aware of these things without saying, it's nonsense or it's just one of those things. You will, Jay, I'm sure, become a greater and bigger person, a super person, as it were. Now, you know what I mean by that, one who is beyond one world and aware of many things, and the wisdom of that. Just keep it simple. And I'd say do a little meditation, get some guidance on it. If you're lucky enough to have, say, a Zen center near you, they are very open people, and they'll very often have public meditation sessions. You learn the basics.
For free.
Yeah. We're lucky to have one near us.
Yeah.
And so anyway, that's I'd say that's the initial advice. Keep it simple, and get yourself a little bit organized as far as life is concerned. Okay, so let's stop here for just a brief commercial break. I just wanted to mention the gift shop at the Museum of Work and Culture down here in Woonsocket, Rhode Island. Because I know we have listeners all over the world, but if you ever have the chance to get to New England, make sure you stop in Rhode Island, which is not very big. So drive slowly or you'll miss it.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of wonderful, wonderful things here in the Blackstone Valley, particularly, which is shared with Massachusetts, between Worcester and Providence. Lots of wonderful bike trails, beautiful scenery, nice and interesting things to do. Little museums, craft shops, things of that kind. And we have the Museum of Work and Culture in the city of Woonsocket. It's a wonderful Disney quality sort of a place that talks about and illustrates the history, the labor history of the Blackstone Valley here, which is the birthplace of the American Industrial Revolution. And I would suggest that you go to the gift shop there, and if you're interested in purchasing my books when you're in town, they usually have them stocked, and including my history of Rhode Island that I wrote with Glenn Laxton of Providence's Channel 12, and which is used in several school districts now, and you can get that as well as my paranormal titles. And of course, also you can go to BehindTheParanormal.com. Order them from there, or Amazon and all the usual suspects in that regard. So check them out. And any questions, certainly send them in by means of our form on the Behind the Paranormal site. And we will get to them once we get through the 175 people we're dealing with right now. But that's where you can get my books. And I hope you do get hold of them and enjoy them. Okay, here's another one here. This is from Matt in Austin, Texas, and Matt points out what he believes is a grammatical error on the website, which is probably a mistake since professionally I am an editor of books, newspapers, and things for 30 years, and he makes a noble effort, but I don't think he's right. But we'll skip that and go to his comment about something else.
All right, so also thanks for mentioning how it's possible to know with certainty that we know anything, or we don't know anything. I also like the science/straight ruler to reality/basketball analogy. But sincerely, how do you even know that?
That's a very good question, Matt. Essentially, this is a question about the nature of knowledge. How do we know anything, whether it comes to the paranormal or anything else? And he's referring to an analogy I used on Coast to Coast, which was the idea. People ask, well, how do you make paranormal things acceptable to modern science? Okay, whatever that may mean. And I've always been an advocate that you can't. First of all, scientists are human as well as a number of other things, and they will, and for the true believer, no proof is required. For the unbeliever, no proof is enough. So you're never going to prove anything to modern science. They've been trying to do that since 1880, when a group of psychiatrists, or psychologists rather, got together, and among and other people who were interested in finding out what was going on in the realm of mediums and psychics, and they formed the Society for Psychical Research in London, and eventually there was an American Society for Psychical Research in America, of which I've been a member for many years. And they finally, they seem to be deciding finally, you're not going to prove anything to modern science. Now they're getting into transpersonal psychology and other things that kind of go beyond the realm of science and look at the mind and its own powers. And the basketball analogy was this. I suggested that the scientific method and science itself, as we use it, is a straight ruler. And the paranormal, or reality, is a basketball. And you can't measure a basketball with a straight ruler. Therefore, people just sort of say, well, all right, well, the basketball must not exist. Well, that's really stupid. Generations and generations and generations back to the last ice age and probably before knew that the paranormal existed, that God existed, that these things were real.
It's very arrogant to say otherwise.
Extremely. We live in a very arrogant society, and we wonder, relying on such forms of knowledge, why we don't know anything.
And why no one likes us.
Yeah, why nobody likes us, why we're not satisfied, why we're kind of lying by the side of the road and we're all well fed, but completely empty spiritually and morally and in a way intellectually. So I think that's a good question. How do we even know that? The fact is we don't know anything, and we have to have the humility to admit it. And that's where it really begins. I think we just take the best we can of our observations, realize that the arrogance does not work, and just humbly cling to one another. Because in the end, all we have is God and each other. And the question is, well, what is God? And all this stuff. Well, that's for another show. But I think I wanted to just pat Matt on the back here. I think it's a good question. We just start at the beginning.
Pat Matt on the back.
Pat Matt, yeah, okay.
Lol.
All right. Here is one. This is from Richard, and it doesn't say where he's from. But again, this is another example of how don't write people off as crazy just yet. Not that I'm saying that he is. I don't think he is. But Matt's going to read it. Ben's going to read it.
Thanks for calling me Matt.
Pat on the back.
The guy called me Brian yesterday. All right, I once went to ancient Egypt to see some of the construction of what was called the Great Egyptian Pyramid. Time of event was around 10,000 BC. This was no daydream, as when I returned, I had sand in my shoes. There is more to this event, but I'm not very good with emails. So,
okay.
Richard.
All right. Yes, Richard. And again, before you write this off, Richard, he had a dream, or maybe he did. Maybe he is crazy. Maybe he had just a dream. But a lot of the so-called crazy people whom I dealt with in psychiatric hospitals, I believed, were experiencing real worlds. This is where I first got some of these ideas. Real worlds, and were not crazy at all. And essentially, to understand how this would work, you look at what the multiverse, as we call it, really is. Again, it's this enormous collection or family, interactive collection of parallel realities in which all things are possible. So somewhere or somewhen in the multiverse, Richard really is in ancient Egypt. And it's very possible that he, either through a dream or through some other alternative experience, alternative form of consciousness, became aware of where he already is living a life in ancient Egypt. Again, time doesn't mean anything. Anything that has occurred or will occur is taking place in these one of the worlds or more of this multiverse, and we're there in many of them. And so this is a very common experience. Shamans, I'm always referring to shamans, who are, you might refer to them as tribal medicine men or women, the great spiritual leaders of some of the so-called primitive cultures. We'll talk about this matter-of-factly, that they routinely travel into these other worlds and find information or do things that will help their people. Sometimes it's good information, sometimes it's bad, but they will travel routinely in these worlds. They'll tell you that they've been to other planets or this sort of thing. And these people come from traditions like the Australian Aborigines, whose traditions go back at least 30,000 years without a break. I think that deserves some respect. And these people are not necessarily stoned or high. They are people who know what the big picture is.
A little fun fact, there's a Pizza Hut right across from the pyramids of Giza. So they can,
is that true?
So they can eat pizza and look at the pyramids of Giza.
All right, well, hopefully wherever, if you go to, well, I'm sure it wasn't there in ancient Egypt, but they
I
don't know.
I don't know, maybe.
All right, well, next time you go to Egypt, whether it's ancient Egypt or not, take advantage of the...
Pretty sure they didn't have pizza in
I don't think
Egypt.
we're supposed to be advertising.
Well, I'm not advertising, I'm just saying a little fun fact.
Well, we can send them a bill.
Well, I guess.
Yeah, all right, okay, all right. So, again, don't be too sure what you write off. And I learned that even in journalism. Don't be too sure what not to believe. Okay, here's a person. This is Z. Is just the first initial from Lawton, Oklahoma. And Z refers to a term that is interesting, the omniverse. Okay? Again, words are not quite enough to really talk about this, but here's what Z has to say.
Omnivores, omniverse. I wanted to take a moment and thank you both for addressing this subject matter on C2C the other night. I have been writing a blog on this subject for several years now, and if you care to read it, here's the link. And she gives the link.
You can give the link, it's all right.
Okay, quantumpsychonautics.blogspot.com.
Maybe we should put it on the Behind the Paranormal website.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah,
let's do that.
It's interesting.
Yeah, okay, so I also wanted to say that this sort of perspective is sorely lacking within the greater paranormal studies community, as well as the ufology and related communities. If any real and true wisdom is to be gained within these other subjects of study, then this new way of looking at life and the omniverse needs to be taken in.
I've also heard, that's, can I say that? Thank you.
Oh, I didn't know you would want to say
all right. No, but the term omniverse is interesting. I've also heard the term metaverse.
Ugh.
And that was first used, remember we had a contest question on that. People thought I invented the term, but it was actually first used in the 1890s. And because these concepts were coming forward. But I think Z here is another, ZP are the full initials, sort of gets it as well. A lot of people are beginning in the paranormal community, if you will, whether it be people who research ghosts or UFOs or everything. They're beginning to kind of get used to the idea of a big picture with all this. Because Ben and I use this to explain all areas of the paranormal, not just quote-unquote ghosts, But when we research stuff, and we research things for years in some cases, more and more will come out, things that seem to be unrelated paranormally, and they do seem to be related by the process, which is the crossing of world boundaries here. And again, maybe we're all wrong, maybe the spiritualists are right, but so far it doesn't look that way. But thank you for your comment, Z, there. Sounds like, Men in Black or something. I don't like to give people's names on the air. You never know what's going to come back to haunt them. Okay, here's one from Don in Elyria, Ohio. Okay.
And the man from Elyria writes, I listened to you on Coast to Coast last night and thought you had a very unique point of view on the subject of the afterlife. As I listened, I thought that your view on the hereafter could be summarized as all time exists at the same time. Comments? ?
Okay, that's essentially it. Somebody wrote in last week and said, to quote literally, it was, if time don't exist, explain rust. Okay, well, I never said that time didn't exist. No one said that. I just said that it was a function of our consciousness. It's, as Einstein said, it's relative.
Yes.
Ben used the example of sitting in class that he enjoys, and then before you know it, time's gone, and it seemed like...
Even though I've been there for 2.5 hours.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like 2.5 hours. So, all depends. And, the old sayings, time flies when you're having fun, all that business. So yes, essentially all these things in this multiverse, if it's correct interpretation, exist at the same time. That includes, well, if you look in my book, and even on the website, I think it's a New England Ghosts website. You'd think I'd know that. I'll tell you where it is. It's on the BehindTheParanormal.com website, the show website. On the Talking Points page, if you scroll down a couple of miles, you'll see my own illustration. Very simplistic, admittedly, of the multiverse and how it works. And it's a bunch of circles, or as we use the analogy, bubbles, all existing side by side as they would in your bathtub or your sink. And in each one, I have a little illustration. One has Vincent van Gogh and the world of 1910. Another one has two people walking a dog in the modern times. Another one has a Roman soldier in it. And this is an illustration of the multiverse. We're only conscious of it. And when I say function of our consciousness, we're conscious of one moment in the multiverse at a time. And it flows in a normal, understandable manner because that's the way our consciousness and our joint consciousness as a species organizes it. Were we outside of that, we would experience all these different worlds at the same time, which we're not really capable of doing. It might appear that we were crazy, or it might really drive us crazy. So we can only experience this on certain levels, and it's usually not the conscious level, although the shamans do experience it on the conscious level. So what we're talking about here is, yes, things all occur at the same time, apparently, past, future, and everything in between. So I think that's a very good comment. A lot of people, Ben, I think, are becoming more aware of this sort of thing. Their consciousness is expanding because of it, and we're getting a lot of positive feedback because of it. And again, it's not because of Ben and me. We just give information. There are a lot of other people talking about this too.
Or it's because the world boundaries are fading.
Well, that's another thing. Just to mention that, world boundaries are electromagnetic. We believe we have photographs of them. They're brilliantly lit because of the plasma, I think, that's involved. And I think we might be looking at the traditional definition of the word light. Go to the light. You hear all this from mediums and psychics. Well, what the light is, apparently, is world boundaries. And if you tell somebody to go to the light, they might be crossing into a world that's hellish. So I'd be very careful about that if I were you.
Run away from it.
Yeah, exactly.
Don't go there. Stop.
So in any case, that might be all part of the explanation that we believe is responsible for paranormal events. So again, that's I think you're absolutely right there, Don, about that time issue. Okay, now here's a very serious one. This is from Kathy in Redding, California, and it's about exorcism.
Great. So Kathy writes here, I admire your work on poltergeists and parasites. My question is, have you ever been involved in an exorcism, or how do you explain it with your theories?
Okay, that's a hard question to answer because the memories are very bad. I was involved especially as a seminary student and as a grad student, in 5 exorcisms. Now, seminary students ordinarily are not involved in things like that. However, I was in the unique position of having started my work in the paranormal without official sanction from the church, I might add, in the the early 70s, certainly. And it led me to contact and become the sort of under the wing of a man named Father John J. Nicola, who was a Jesuit priest, who was probably the leading exorcist expert and exorcism expert of the time. He was the technical advisor for the film The Exorcist, something that he regretted until his dying day. And I would see him relatively frequently. He was in Washington, D.C., in a very anonymous job that allowed him to spend a lot of time on this subject. And he was assistant director of the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception. Now, it so happened that my brother, Ben's uncle, was a Catholic priest who taught on the faculty of the Catholic University of America, in the midst of whose campus is this huge basilica. I believe it's the largest church in America. It's quite distinctive, with Byzantine architecture and a huge dome that's quite unforgettable. And he was Father Nicola was known to my brother, and my brother brought us together, and I became sort of a student of his. And I'd see him rather frequently as I went down. So between him and another priest in Ogdensburg, Diocese of New York, where I was a student in the seminary in the mid to late 70s, I was involved in several exorcisms, notably at several state hospitals where I was working, Ogdensburg and Norwich state hospitals, one in New York, one in Connecticut, both of which are mercifully closed now. Looking back on it, of course, I had the theological approach at the time, and looking back on it, I think that what happens is this. The notion of parasites, which are traditionally known as demons or evil spirits, or even vampires, because as I often say, these things are described in ancient literature, I mean really ancient literature, as life-sucking ghosts. And as I would run into these things, and now Ben and I say, this is what these things, they're parasitical. They're not spirits. They're life forms from one or more of these parallel worlds we've been talking about, feeding upon people here and elsewhere as as a mosquito would, almost. Only they're eating not blood, but energy, which apparently is their source of sustenance. And so you can just see how in folklore these things would become, because people didn't understand parallel worlds and stuff, maybe at least not the way we do today, they would understand that these were some sort of spirits or demons or whatever, because they don't do us any good. So in any case, these things seem to be the reason for exorcisms and what we call possession. When they get involved with someone, they will attach themselves to a host, in our case here, humans, and usually someone who is very weak, very vulnerable, and they at times will bond with the host. I don't know, those of you who are of my vintage, you might remember the Patty Hearst incidents 40-odd years ago, when the daughter of a great media magnate was kidnapped by a bunch of terrorists, homegrown terrorists here in America, and actually bonded with them to the point of becoming one of them. And she ran around for years before she was caught. And I think she never was. I think she turned herself in. But she became part of this terrorist group. And we often see this in terrorist situations, not often, but sometimes, where people will literally become sympathetic to the cause of the people who are holding them prisoner. This will sometimes happen in parasite cases. People will bond with them. We had one woman, this is before Ben's time, but she was here in Rhode Island, and she was actually writing love poems to this thing, who she believed was a ghost, who was a lover from a former life. And that's obviously not quite how it seems to work, but it was a parasite and non-human entity that was sucking her energy. And when this gets to the point of
no return,
well, there's always a return, but bonding, and we might call it possession. It certainly results in the what is traditionally known as demonic possession. I saw this on 5 occasions, and the interesting thing was that when the priest and I went in on this, several of the exorcisms worked. All right, and it was the Roman Catholic formula for exorcism that was used. One or two others, I should say, worked temporarily because the thing came back, and one did not work. And if I looked very carefully today at what I think I know now and didn't know then, the one that didn't work was a person who just had very, very little belief in God, or at least the Roman Catholic approach to God and this sort of thing. And it seems that the more people believe or have a deep faith somewhere left in them, the more it works.
It's like what Jesus said in the Bible.
Your faith has made you well, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, very, very often people forget that. They think Jesus kind of was sort of sweeping through Palestine and healing everybody. Well, he would always say, your faith has made you well. He didn't say, I did it. He said, you did it, essentially.
Yeah.
And in Nazareth...
Like the one guy that actually said he did it was Moses, and then he was barred from Eden. Not Eden, the Promised Land.
Oh, that's right. I think he died before the people could go in.
No, he was still alive. He was just hanging out there. Outside.
When it was on top of the mountain, kind of watching people go in. But he never entered the Promised Land.
No.
Well, anyway, when Jesus in Matthew goes to Nazareth and his own hometown, which is interesting because there's some evidence Nazareth wasn't built until the 3rd century AD. Mm-hmm. Anyway, he was unable. The gospel says he was unable, and that's what it says in Greek too. He was unable to do any miracles there. And people came and said, "Well, we knew you as a kid. We watched you grow up, and who do you think you are?" And people didn't have any faith. And so it's faith that's everything. So even in cases of exorcism, we had people who, the more faith they had down deep, the more they were able to rid themselves, or through the help of the exorcism ceremony, or ritual, of these parasites. But essentially, I've seen, I suppose what amount to exorcisms is, without using any rituals, by people just being told to bring in positive energy. So I'm not saying, it's not legitimate, but I think that it's narrow, and other approaches could be used. Sometimes there are really, really negative results, I have heard, to exorcisms. It depends who's doing them. I did not see that myself. But again, two of them seemed to work, 2 worked temporarily, and 1 did not work at all. And it kind of confused the priest in me. I have seen other forms of divine intervention. We had a priest on locally here on our show one time, and I said, the name of Jesus is extremely powerful, but I said, you really want to see him scatter, try the name of Isis, the ancient Egyptian goddess Isis, who was well known even today among people of the Mediterranean, and people might say, well, she was adopted by Christians as the Virgin Mary, that's all heretical to say that, of course, but there are all sorts of views on that, but her name is incredibly powerful and certainly positive. So again, it depends on your faith. So that's the best way I can really answer that, and according to my theories, Kathy's question here, that's a matter of again, the multiverse and these things coming in and just attaching themselves to people. And I think the critical thing to realize with possession, demonic possession as it's called, is that there has to be some sort of tacit agreement on the part of the victim. Sounds funny, but I don't think these things can just come in and take over your personality unless in a way down deep you agree to it. And I think folklore knows this. I've often used the idea, you remember in the story of Dracula.
Oh, yes.
Jonathan Harker, he's at the castle in Transylvania, and Dracula comes to the door and says, before he lets him in, he says, "Enter of your own free will." In other words, Dracula couldn't take him and drag him into the castle against his will.
Yeah.
So in a way, this is kind of a funny folklore-ish memory, because folklore is the vessel of the memory of the human race.
Yeah.
That you have to kind of almost agree to this. It's kind of scary. Actually, it's very scary, and I hope I never have to witness it again. But that's the answer to the question. All right. I've still got a few minutes here. Okay. This is a question about mental illness, or a comment about mental illness from, I guess it's Galen in Paris, Texas.
Great. I'm from Paris, France. I'm so glad to see someone thinks it's possible that things that exist in interfacing multi-dimensions do at times become available for bleed-through events and communications. It appears to me you accept that we just don't have the tools yet for everyone to see what's there, but it's there nonetheless. It will someday be scientific fact, just as the bacteria and dust mites we once couldn't see now are.
Yeah, well, that's a good point. It's not really a question here, Gil, but he makes a good point.
Well, what's interesting is in one of the books I've read, I think it was Dave Piglet, like it was saying how it was poking fun at science, and it was saying how, oh yeah, science once said, oh, it's impossible to do this stuff. It was like, oh, it's impossible to go into space, and yet like 20 years later they went into space. It's impossible to fly, and yet people flew, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The list goes on and on and on and on. And now they're like, the paranormal doesn't exist. Well,
exactly. Well, one thing I'm going to point out too, Ben, is that in 2 weeks we're going to have Kathleen Marden back on the show, and Kathleen is the niece of Betty and Barney Hill, and Betty and Barney Hill were the famous couple from 1961 who were the first major the first people who were abducted supposedly by aliens in New Hampshire, and they were. The case was picked up by the news, the first one really to earn major media coverage around the world. And she has just finished a book with our friend Stan Friedman, the great UFO researcher from Canada, and the two of them wrote a book called Science Was Wrong. And it goes into example after example after example of how science to say, well, this is the way it is, and then it turned out to be incorrect, as you just suggested.
Yeah, science has been wrong in the past.
Yeah, so. And we don't mean to badmouth science all the time, because half the time the problem isn't science, it's scientists who are narrow-minded or arrogant or this sort of thing. And I kind of found that out in the late 70s, early 80s, when I was running around trying to find physicists who would back up what I was beginning to suspect, which was this multiverse idea. And I'd go to university campuses looking for them, and some of them were sympathetic. Others would kind of look down their nose and sniff that I had the wrong academic degrees, because my degree was in philosophy and not physics. And others would say, well, it can't be this way, you don't know what you're talking about. No. Others were sympathetic, but would not come along on any investigations or look into it because they were afraid of their jobs. So that seems to be an ongoing issue with folks. So anyway, tune in 2 weeks. We're going to have Kathleen Marden on. She lives in Florida, and she's going to talk about the case of her aunt and uncle's abduction. And we're kind of doing the show again because we had her on our CBS show on Sunday night a few weeks ago, and there was such incredible interference, and CBS didn't know where it came from. This has happened to us several times when we talk about this subject, that we even lost the podcast. So we have a famous lost show, but we'll have her back here. Okay, let's wrap up here, sorry to say. And again, check out our show website, BehindTheParanormal.com. There are all sorts of stuff about our future guests, past guests, and all sorts of information about upcoming shows. And also over 200 podcasts of previous shows, both on CBS, WOON here, and also on the Achieve Radio internet station that we have been using for several years now. So, many thanks to our producer, the great Craig Pelletier. And we'll see you right here on next Monday, November 8th, on WOON 1240 AM and ONWorldwide.com in New England's beautiful Blackstone Valley at 6 p.m. Eastern, 3 Pacific. Our guest will be the great British compiler of UFO data, Philip Mantle, and that will be a pre-recorded interview.
All right, so on our regular Sunday show on November 7th, 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 Pacific, on CBS Radio in Boston, Pittsburgh, Detroit, Seattle, and online at www.newskyradio.com and www.parax.com. We'll welcome New England broadcaster Dave Kane for a look at his family's ongoing contact with his son, Nicky, youngest victim of the station nightclub fire in Rhode Island in 2003.
Okay, and tonight we leave you with a quote about the multiverse from, of all people, that skeptic of skepticemics, Michael Shermer. Quote, from what we now know about the cosmos, to think that all this was created for just one species among tens of millions... I can't finish the quote because we don't have time. Okay, I'll finish. All right. Among tens of millions of species who live on one planet, circling one of a couple of 100 billion stars located in one galaxy among hundreds of billions of galaxies, all of which are in one universe among